The whole room cheered the moment. My father pressed the cabin keys into my brother's palm, and my brother smirked at me over Dad's shoulder before he'd even closed his fingers around them. I'd been bracing for it all weekend. Everyone in my family had been bracing for it, really. The way you brace for weather you've already checked the forecast on. My brother Tyler had always been the one. The golden one. Mom and Dad never said it out loud. Not in so many words, but you don't need words when you've spent 31 years reading the room. Tyler got the benefit of the doubt. Tyler got the bailout when his business idea fell through. Tyler got invited to just stop by. No occasion dinners that I only heard about after the fact. I got the polite nod and the, "You're so independent, we never worry about you," which is a compliment that, after enough years, starts to feel like being told you're easy to forget. My name is Renee Castellan, and I was 34 years old the weekend my family gathered at our grandfather's cabin on Georgian Bay to celebrate Tyler closing on his first restaurant. A bistro in Collingwood, financed mostly by a line of credit Dad had co-signed without blinking. I'd built my own life in Toronto without anyone co-signing anything. I worked in corporate finance. I owned my condo outright after 8 brutal years of overtime and instant noodles, and I'd learned a long time ago that asking my parents for help was a door that only swung open for other people. The cabin had been in our family since my grandfather, Walter Castellan. No, that's not right. His name was Desmond Castellan. Built it with his own hands in the early 70s, back when a stretch of shoreline on Georgian Bay wasn't the kind of thing that made realtors weak in the knees. By the time I was a kid, it was already legend in our family, the place where every summer collapsed into one long golden blur of dock jumping and bonfires, and my grandfather telling stories that got a little taller every year. He passed almost 5 years ago now, and ever since, an assumption had calcified into something everyone treated as settled law. The cabin would go to Tyler. Not because anyone had decided it. Because nobody had ever imagined otherwise. Tyler certainly hadn't. The week before the party he'd called me, breezy, half distracted by something in the background. "You should see what I'm thinking for the boathouse," he said. "Converting it into a proper guest suite. Heated floors, the whole thing. The boathouse," I repeated. "At the cabin. I mean, once Dad signs it over officially." He laughed like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like we were discussing what to order for lunch. "It's basically already mine anyway." I didn't say anything to that. I'd stopped arguing with reality a long time ago. You learn where you stand, and then you stand there. And you build something of your own a few hundred kilometers away, where nobody's expectations can reach you. The day of the party, the gravel lot beside the cabin was packed with cars by noon. Aunts and uncles and cousins I only saw twice a year. All of them in sun hats and deck shoes. All of them talking about Tyler's restaurant like it was already a Toronto Life feature. Someone had strung lights along the porch railing. Someone else had brought 3 different kinds of potato salad. I stood near the kitchen island for most of the afternoon, refilling drinks, the way I always ended up doing at these things, half listening to conversations that all somehow circled back to my brother. "He's going to redo the dock, you know," I heard my Aunt Vanessa say to someone, except her name wasn't Vanessa. It was Diane. "New decking. Maybe one of those floating ones. And the kitchen needs updating regardless," her husband added. Tyler was saying, "The cabinets are original." Nobody phrased any of it as a question. Nobody said, if or when there's a decision. It had simply been decided, somewhere in the collective imagination of my entire extended family, and I was the only one standing there who'd never agreed to it. Around 6, with the light going long and amber over the water, my father tapped a fork against his glass. The crowd drifted toward the porch steps. Tyler moved to the front like he'd been waiting for his cue, which I realized later he probably had been. Dad put an arm around his shoulders. "We wanted everyone here today," Dad said, "because some milestones are worth celebrating properly." A ripple of laughter. My mother already had her phone out, recording. "Tyler's worked incredibly hard this year, and your mother and I couldn't be prouder of the man he's become. He reached into his jacket pocket. I knew before I saw them what was coming. A small brass keyring, the same one that had hung by the cabin's back door, my entire childhood. 3 keys and a faded wooden fob shaped like a loon. This place has always been about family, Dad said, his voice catching the way it did when he was trying not to get emotional in front of a crowd. And we think it's time it officially belonged to the next generation. Tyler, this is yours. The applause was instant and enormous. People stood up. My cousin's kids cheered without really knowing why. Tyler took the keys and held them up like he'd just won something at a fair, grinning out at all of us. And for one full second, I watched my entire family's expectations land exactly where everyone had always assumed they would. Then a folding chair scraped hard against the porch boards. The sound cut through the applause like a thrown stone through glass. Heads turned. Near the back, half in shadow under the porch overhang, our family's lawyer, a quiet, precise man named Graham Whitlock, stood up slowly. He wasn't smiling. He had a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, the kind of thing you don't bring to a party unless you're expecting to need it. My father's smile faltered. Everything all right, Graham? There's a matter I've been asked to address, Graham said, his voice carrying easily over the now quiet crowd. Before the afternoon goes any further, the silence that followed had texture to it. You could hear the water lapping at the dock pilings. Graham opened the portfolio and drew out an envelope. Cream-colored, soft at the corners, with age sealed with a strip of tape that had clearly been replaced at some point to keep it from giving way. Across the front, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, all sharp angles and stubborn upward slants, were 8 words. To be opened when Tyler takes ownership of the cabin. I felt the air change before anyone said a word. Tyler's grin held for a beat too long, the way a smile does right before someone realizes the jokes landed somewhere they didn't expect. "What is that?" my father asked, his voice gone careful. "A letter," Graham said. "Left with my office by your father-in-law 5 years ago, with very specific instructions about when it could be opened." He looked around at all of us. "That condition has now been met." My mother pressed a hand to her chest. "Desmond left a letter? Why wouldn't he have just? He had his reasons," Graham said simply. He was very clear about that. Tyler set the keys down on the porch railing, slowly, like they'd suddenly gotten heavier. "I'm sure it's just sentimental. Some old man wisdom about the cabin." Nobody answered him. Graham broke the seal carefully, almost reverently, and unfolded 3 pages of handwritten paper. He cleared his throat. "If you're hearing this read aloud," he began, reading my grandfather's words in his own steady voice, "then it means the day has finally come that everyone always assumed would arrive. Tyler's standing at the cabin with the keys in his hand, and the rest of you standing around him, clapping." A nervous laugh rippled through a few people near the front, the kind of laugh that doesn't know yet if it's allowed. Graham continued, "I want to say, first, that I understand why you all assumed it would go this way. Tyler is a wonderful young man, and I love him as much as I love any of my grandchildren. But assumption is not the same thing as a plan, and for years I've watched this family build a plan out of nothing more than assumption." Tyler's jaw tightened. My father's eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, and I felt something cold drop through my stomach because I hadn't expected to be looked at all. "The cabin was never going to pass directly to any one of you," Graham read. "Years ago, I placed it into a family trust, structured so that it could never be sold off, subdivided, or used as collateral against some new venture that might not work out." A few people glanced uneasily toward Tyler, who'd done exactly that with 2 prior business attempts before the restaurant. The trust would activate the moment the family, in its collective certainty, finally tried to hand the property to the person everyone believed deserved it most. I knew this day would come. I built the conditions so it would. "Fine," Tyler said, his voice tighter now, a thin current of anger running underneath the words. "So who's it going to, then? Just say it." Graham lowered the pages just enough to meet my brother's eyes, and then deliberately turned to look at me. "Renee," he said. "Renee Castellane is the named trustee. effective immediately. Full management authority, control of the trust accounts, and final decision-making power over the property. Time did something strange in that moment. I heard the words land, but it took my body a few seconds to catch up to what they meant. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind me, a gull cried out over the water, and it sounded absurdly loud. My mother turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger, not even surprise exactly. Something closer to a kind of dawning recalculation, like she was rapidly rerunning 30 years of conversations through a different filter. Tyler let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's a joke. That has to be some kind of joke. It isn't, Graham said quietly. There's been a mistake, my father said, stepping forward, his voice rising. Graham, there has to be some kind of error here. Renee doesn't even. She lives in the city. She's barely been up here the last few summers. There's no error, Graham said. Desmond drafted this with my office personally 6 years ago, well before he passed. He reviewed and reconfirmed it 18 months before his death. I have his notes, his signature, 3 witnesses. He reached back into the portfolio and produced a second folder, thinner, which he handed directly to me. My hands were unsteady taking it. Inside were trust documents, a deed, transfer paperwork already processed. All access credentials and account authorizations transferred automatically this afternoon. The moment the keys changed hands at this gathering. That was the trigger condition. I stared down at the papers without really reading them. Everything was typed in the flat official language of something that had clearly been thought through with enormous care by someone who'd had years to consider exactly how this moment would unfold and had decided deliberately that it would unfold like this. In front of everyone, at the worst possible second for anyone to pretend it hadn't happened. Why? Tyler said, and his voice cracked slightly in a way I'd never heard from him before. Not once in 31 years of being the one who never had to ask twice for anything. Why would Grandpa do this to me? Graham returned to the letter. Tyler, my boy, you have a wonderful heart and a restless one, and I love you fiercely for both. But this place was never meant to be a reward for being loved the most. It was meant to be looked after by someone who'd already proven, again and again, without anyone asking her to, that she could be trusted with something fragile and keep it whole. My throat closed up. I hadn't expected to be moved. I'd spent so many years building a kind of armor around exactly this subject. The favoritism. The quiet years of being overlooked. That I'd forgotten what it would feel like to hear, from beyond the grave, that someone had actually been paying attention the whole time. Renee spent every summer of her childhood up here asking me questions. Nobody else cared to ask, Graham read on. How the well system worked. Why we needed to reseal the dock every 3rd year. What happened if the lake ice took out a piling? She remembers things. She follows through on things. I used to think I was just answering a curious kid's questions on the porch. It took me a long time to understand. I was training the only person in this family who'd actually keep this place standing for the next 50 years. I remembered those conversations now with a sudden, almost physical clarity. Long evenings on the dock with my grandfather, a thermos of tea between us, him explaining the well pump or the septic field or how to read weather coming in off the bay. And me asking another question because I genuinely wanted to know, never once imagining it was anything other than 2 people who liked talking to each other. This isn't fair, Tyler said, but the heat had mostly gone out of it. He sounded, more than anything, like a much younger version of himself, the one who used to lose at board games and sulk for an hour after. I found my voice before I'd quite decided to use it. It was never supposed to be fair, I said. It was supposed to be right. Everyone turned to look at me. I hadn't said more than a dozen words all afternoon, and suddenly I was the center of a silence. I didn't know how to fill, so I just kept going, because the alternative was letting it sit there unanswered. I'm not going to pretend I'm not stunned, I said. I genuinely had no idea. But I think if any of us are honest, we built this whole weekend around an assumption nobody actually checked. We just decided how this was going to go and then acted surprised when reality didn't follow the script. I looked at Tyler, and some of the old tightness between us, the kind that had calcified over 30 years of small slights and unspoken comparisons, loosened just slightly. This doesn't mean you're locked out of this place. I'm not going to do that to you. Grandpa built this so it would last, not so it could be used to keep score. My mother started crying, quietly. The kind of crying that isn't really about the moment in front of her but about every year stacked up behind it. My father wouldn't meet my eyes, and I understood, watching him stare down at the dock, that he was doing the same recalculation my mother had started a few minutes earlier, running back through years of dinners I hadn't been invited to and bailouts I'd never been offered, and not liking very much what the math added up to. The sun kept sinking the way it does on the bay in late summer, indifferent to all of it, throwing long, gold light across the water and turning the dock boards the color of honey. Nobody was looking at the keys sitting on the porch railing anymore. Every eye in that yard had shifted to the folder in my hands. For years, my whole family had quietly agreed that the cabin would go to the child they loved out loud. In the end, my grandfather had spent the better part of a decade making sure it went instead to the one he'd actually trusted, the one who never asked to be noticed, and who, it turned out, he'd been watching the entire time.